Williams is a journalist and author whom I've known and been friendly with for several years. But I didn't ask him to do a Mr. Media interview simply because we're buddies, so much as I think that his recent book, The Draft, A Year Inside the NFL Search for Talent, was an overlooked sports journalism classic from 2006 that more people should be exposed to. Pete, who's a longtime fitness enthusiast and journalist, is a regular contributor to Men's Health magazine and has written a number of sports-related books, some as sole author, others, such as the Core Performance series with Mark Verstegen. Their third book, Core Performance Endurance, written for runners, cyclists, swimmers, and triathletes, was released in January 2007, and Core Performance Golf is slated for 2008. Pete also has an interesting private life that in the last year has become an open secret. He's a practicing nudist. I say it's an open secret because Pete is the co-host, along with Sabrina Vazari, of The Fitness Buff, a weekly radio show that combines two of his interests, physical fitness and nudity. I don't think this will be a dull interview. Hi, Pete.
Hi, Bob.
Hey, thanks for taking time out to do this.
Great to be here.
Wherever we are. Pete, I have to ask, are you clothed or unclothed for the interview?
I am dressed, but as we're conducting this interview, I do have the Fitness Buff show later in the day from Paradise Lakes.
Okay.
So I guess I have to get in that mindset sooner or later.
So, all right, and we'll come back and talk to that. But I just thought it would be kind of weird, and I was hoping whether you were clothed or not clothed, you would just say clothed. So, that aside, let's talk about your book, The Draft. What prompted you to write it?
Yeah, Bob, I've always been fascinated by the NFL draft process and why there's so much interest in it, because if you think about it, it's a pretty boring television show, and that's certainly what Pete Rozelle, NFL commissioner, thought way back when ESPN came to him and said, hey, we'd like to televise what's essentially a two-day business meeting of a bunch of guys sitting around calling out names. I mean, think if your fantasy football draft was televised. That's essentially what it is. But a cottage industry has emerged, and 35 million people tune into some portion of the draft, which is phenomenal. It's one of the highest-rated programs, cable or otherwise, in the month of April every year. And so I was fascinated not just by that phenomenon, but how teams actually evaluated talent. You'd watch and you'd see some guy you'd never heard of from Southeast North Dakota State go in the second round, and then some guy who finished third or fourth in the Heisman Trophy balloting not get drafted at all. I was just real curious how teams evaluated talent, and I learned it's a year-long process that has a lot of machinations to it. There's a calendar. There's almost a draft season, really, that starts right after the final bowl game with players preparing, and then, of course, all the evaluations, which have been going on for 6 months prior to that. And then I was also curious as to how agents recruit these players. It all seemed a little shady, to say the least, and I wanted to learn more about that process. Finally, I wanted to find out how the players and the colleges dealt with all this, because they have this onslaught of interest both from NFL scouts and the agents on campus and how they made sense of it all. So I had those four parties, and I wanted to spend a calendar year, well, not a calendar year, but indeed a year from May 1st to April 30th, showing how all this takes place.
So it was almost a real-time project.
Yeah, it really was. I didn't start on May 1st, although I had the, I guess I started doing the legwork, but certainly in the summer of 2004 was when I really started talking to agents and later the Atlanta Falcons and rounding up some players. And so in that sense, yeah, no doubt.
I think what you say is true. If you think about a two-day show that just shows people being drafted, and that sounds, about as exciting as burnt toast. But we've known each other a while, and I knew while you were working on the book, and I like to watch a football game. That's the extent of my interest. I don't get involved in fantasy football, and so I thought, well, as a friend and as someone who wants to support you, I'm going to read the book, but I wasn't going at it I wasn't really expecting a lot. But the thing I loved about the book was it really got into, you really took us behind the scenes. You painted a picture, you lifted the curtain. It's just it's a lot of great anecdotes, it's a lot of great insight and color. And one of the things I was wondering is how did you arrange all the access that you had? I mean, and at times it seemed like you were in 12 places at once. And I know that's just the quality of the writing, but you make the reader feel that. But how did you get the access that you had?
Well, it was kind of insane with the travel. I remember there was a stretch in March of 2005 where I think I was in 6 hotel rooms and 6 nights. And it was really a testament not so much to my own diligence, but the access and the willingness that a lot of these parties had to let me into their lives. And I think for the most part, as I've always found as a journalist, is if you explain to people that what you're doing is trying to explain the process, I think they get that for the most part. In other words, you're not doing some expose, although to some degree there is a bit of that in the draft. But I think people just, like anyone in life, if people ask you about what you do, people are happy to explain that, and they're interested in doing so. And so I'm not saying, heck, as a journalist, I've been blown off hundreds, if not thousands of times. I'm under no delusions there. But for the most part, the people I approached, whether they were agents, players, ultimately the people at the Atlanta Falcons, and the colleges that I focused on, for the most part, were very receptive, surprisingly receptive. And the other thing I found is that a lot of this process is remarkably open. Now, you watch the NFL Combine, which is now on the NFL Network quite extensively. That process is virtually media lockdown to the media. I think you probably could get better access to the Bush White House. But the Senior Bowl and some of the pro days and a number of the other elements to this are remarkably wide open. In fact, the Senior Bowl, which is the premier postseason college bowl game, I found to have the greatest media access of any event I've ever covered. The reporters, and there aren't that many that actually go, they wear the same credentials that Jerry Jones wears around. So that access, and so, but that aside, it really took a leap of faith from a number of people, including agents, players, and most notably the Atlanta Falcons.
Are there any stories or anecdotes you can share about the story behind the story, about how you got a certain story, or the lengths that you had to go to get an interview or find something out?
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt I had to spend a lot of time just camping out in places. The Falcons, for instance, Rich McKay in Atlanta and previously in Tampa is known for being about as media receptive as they come. However, I think he did have some reservations about this. And unlike, say, Michael Lewis writing the book Moneyball, who had extremely unlimited access with the Oakland A's, Rich kind of picked and chose at times, and that was fine. On balance, I got what I needed. But boy, there were a couple times I went to Flowery Branch, which is their headquarters in north of Atlanta, and I couldn't get through to anyone there. So that was a little frustrating at times. But given some of the lengths I've had to go through in my career for interviews, certainly in covering Major League Baseball, this wasn't that bad.
Well, I know you've been sort of my go-to person when I've needed to interview someone on the football side, and you've been very blunt about it's very hard to get these guys. They're generally not readily available outside of on game day when they have to be. Yeah.
No, the NFL likes to paint a picture of itself as remarkably media-friendly, and the way they do that is by sending out literally about 50 press releases a day. And they do a phenomenal job of creating the myth of the NFL. You look at it compared to baseball. We have the Mark McGwire situation. He'll never get into the Hall of Fame, whereas in football you have Sean Merriman suspended for 4 games for using steroids, for definitely using steroids. We assume Mark McGwire did, but we don't know for certain. And that's not even a blip on the radar screen in terms of national media coverage, that Sean Merriman was suspended for 25% of this year's NFL season. So the NFL does a phenomenal job of, I dare say, controlling the media. But the way it worked for me is that the 2 players I ultimately focused on in the book, Fred Gibson coming out of the University of Georgia and Chris Canty coming out of Virginia, they were not NFL players. In fact, they weren't really college players. They were done with that. So they were just 2 guys, 2 individuals that I could negotiate for access, if you will, and they were remarkably receptive.
Have you heard from any of the people that you focused on in the book since publication about how it may have affected them or their response to having that aspect of their lives written about?
You know, Bob, I've gotten remarkably little feedback firsthand from any of the central characters in the book. Now, as a journalist, I know that if people are really ticked off, they'll call you about it. If they liked it or they're neutral, you're never going to hear from them,
right.
and that's fine. I have heard through third parties that Jack Sharf, one of the three agents I focused on, wasn't too pleased with it. And actually, he told a couple people that he blamed me in the book for not landing many, in fact, no clients for the 2006 draft, which I found interesting because the book itself didn't come out till late February of 2006, and by then, everyone had signed their players, 6 weeks earlier.
So you think you gave him a convenient scapegoat?
Perhaps. Jack was remarkably forthcoming to me, and Jack's a bit of has a bit of swagger to him, has a bit of arrogance to him, and I think he never told me this was off the record or anything like that, but I think in hindsight he probably said, I probably came across as a little too brash for my own good.
Well, some guys gotta see that happen before they realize how they actually sound.
Yeah. There's no question that happens in journalism all the time, and I certainly wasn't the first guy to interview Jack Sharf, and not the last.
Now, did anyone of great significance decline to participate that, left you a little frustrated?
In the acknowledgments, the only person who categorically turned me down was Drew Rosenhaus. And in hindsight, I think Drew's story has been told enough, and I don't think he was never going to be a central figure in the book. But I did want to talk to him about various things, as I did, more than a dozen agents at length. And even though I only focused on three, and I was never envisioning Drew as one of those three, he was the only guy.
You think Drew, who's historically had a problem of opening his mouth too much, may have decided this was the point at which to contain his thoughts?
I think, if anything, Drew said he was writing his own book on the NFL draft.
Okay.
Drew never turns down a media opportunity when it can help him, and remarkably is very media accessible. Drew does not have an assistant. Everybody has Drew's cell number. It's very easy to get Drew on the phone.
Wow.
But to sit down with Drew for any length of time is difficult because he doesn't have an assistant. He does everything himself with two cell phones. So it's difficult for anybody, I think, to talk to Drew for more than 5 or 10 minutes.
Where did you find the highest level of naivete about the draft and all that it entailed? Was it with the college players? Was it with the college coaches, the pro? I suspect somewhere in there's some people operating with very little sense of what they're dealing with.
Well, certainly the players have to be at the top of that list. But first, there was more of that at the college level than I would have expected. Now, these college coaches, they understand how the world works. They understand these agents are harassing their players all the time, and actually that's illegal. I mean, an agent can contact any player, freshman, sophomore, junior, or senior, any day of the year, so long as he does not provide that player with anything of value. Now, technically, there are rules, state regulations and such. I mean, here in the state of Florida, you supposedly cannot contact a player. Every conversation has to be initiated by the player himself, and this is preposterous. As you can imagine, this is not enforced at all. So technically there are rules along those lines, but the one that most people at least try to pay lip service to is not providing players with anything of value. Now, if you play in your final college bowl game and you walk off the field and you sign with Agent X, and 30 seconds later he gives you a suitcase full of money, that is legal by the NCAA, by your school, by whatever state you live in, and by the NFL Players Association, so long as you didn't get anything before you became a professional athlete. So you can see how this is really the Wild West. And what happens with agents, every agent I interview claims to be the only honest man in the business who doesn't do anything along those lines.
Mm-hmm. Now, do you think you'll follow up the book with any other material? Will you be writing about it? Will you be writing articles about the draft? Will you ever do a subsequent book about the draft?
Well, the paperback is coming out in the spring of this year.
Okay.
And what's interesting, Bob, is, with the book business is, you have long lead times. Even when you write an afterword, which is really only a 5,000-word additional chapter for the paperback, which I did, but I had to turn it in mid-September. So as we sit here in early 2007, that book is not yet out, and I'm thinking, I could bang out 5,000 words this afternoon, which would be much more updated than it was back in mid-September. But that's not how the publishing business works. So I will, I think, on my website, PeteWilliams.net, if nothing else, have some Q&As and some updates that I'll write, and that'll be the extent of it. But I still follow it a great deal. Starting in early January, I started getting calls from sports radio stations who have had me on in the last year, and they want me to have me on again this year. So it's never too early, as Mel Kiper knows, who talks NFL draft 365 days of the year.
Now, I want to point out that we have something in common and something not so in common. We've both had our football books written about by Sports Illustrated. And I'll say mine first. I did a book almost 13 years ago called Why Men Watch Football, and Sports Illustrated named it one week A Sign of the Apocalypse. Now, you had a much better experience with Sports Illustrated, and tell everybody what Sports Illustrated had to say about your football book.
Yeah, SI.com was very kind to my book. They named it the Book of the Month for, it was either March or April of 2006, shortly after it came out, and yeah, they gave it a lot of credit for telling a story that hadn't been told in detail, and I was very appreciative of that. Obviously, that leads to a spike in sales at the time, and so I was up against some other football books that had just come out. John Feinstein had his Baltimore Ravens book at the time, and there were a couple others. So yeah, I was very grateful. The Sporting News and Sports Business Journal were also very kind.
No, I don't know, Pete. I got to say, I think in the long run, 10 or 20 years from now, people are going to remember the book that was a sign of the apocalypse.
Yeah, I would think so too. That's a distinction that I've had some tough critics, but nobody said the draft was a sign of the apocalypse.
No, and it's not. It's a wonderful book to read. Now, tell me a little bit about your relationship with Mark Verstegen in the Core Performance books.
Yeah, Bob, Mark actually ties into the draft very well because he, among other things, trains players for the NFL Combine. Players drop out of school as soon as the football season ends, and then they start going to these Combine training centers, many of which are in warm weather locales, like Mark's Athletes Performance in Phoenix, and they spend 4 to 6 hours a day doing nothing but training for the drills that they'll do at the Combine in late February in Indianapolis. And so Mark, I had a very interesting guy. I had done some stories on because he's trained a number of prominent pro athletes for years. And as he built this phenomenal new training center in Phoenix, I did a number of national stories on him, and he and I started talking about that he should do a book, and then a number of prominent literary agents started calling him, and the deal came together for our first book, Core Performance. Everyone talks about core training to the point where it's become almost I think, hijacked by the fitness magazines to refer to washboard abs, and that's really not what it is. It's about developing your better movement and stability and mobility and flexibility in your hips, your shoulders, and your midsection so that you can, you name it, play better golf, play better tennis, avoid back injuries early 2008. So it's been a great relationship, and along the way I spent so much time out in Phoenix with Mark that I was watching these players year after year who were training for the NFL Combine, and there would always be agents around. I'd be talking to them about the process, and since I've kind of covered the NFL here and there through the years anyway, I kind of knew enough NFL people, and it all started coming together. But certainly being around that environment was a big inspiration for the draft as well.
And, I mean, you've always, well, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that you've always had a personal interest in fitness. I mean,
no question. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I've, like a lot of kids of my generation, I got Arnold's Book of Bodybuilding when I was 12 or 13, and certainly even when I was a full-time baseball writer for most of the 1990s, I would always do a lot of stories. I think I was one of the first people who really would focus on athletes and their training regimens. So, yeah, no question about it. That's always been a big interest to me, both personally and professionally.
Now, do you have other books that you're working on or that you're planning for the coming time? Obviously, you know, with the core performance books, you've got another one in the pipeline, and the paperback for the draft. Is there something else on its way. People should look for?
Yeah, quite a bit. I mean, there's the paperback of Fun is Good, the business motivational book I wrote with Mike Veck that came out in '05. But probably the big thing on the burner is a book I'm writing with Shawn Phillips. It's also a fitness book. Shawn is a fitness guru. He's probably best known, and he's fine with this, as the brother of Bill Phillips, who wrote the best-selling book Body for Life, the best-selling fitness book of all time, in fact. And Bill and Shawn built the company EAS to become a dynasty, really, in the 90s with in the late 80s when you talk about nutritional supplements. And they've since sold the company and moved on to other things. But Shawn's really a remarkable guy in terms of his fitness knowledge, and Bill will be the first to say that Shawn provided basically the workouts for Body for Life. And so my literary agent, who also represents Bill Phillips, started talking to Shawn at Bill's wedding a year or 2 years ago now, and about him writing a book. And so he paired me and Shawn together, and so Shawn and I have been writing this book over the last, 6 or 9 months or so, and that book, we hope, and we don't quite have the title firm down, but we hope it's going to be the book that had the impact here in the 21st century that Body for Life did when it came out in the late 90s.
That's great. Now, let's talk about the Fitness Buff before we wrap things up there. Now, I kid you about this because I as long as I felt that I had known you when this started, when you started promoting the Fitness Buff radio show, I didn't make the connection. I remember we talked about this. It wasn't until I think the Tampa Tribune wrote a story about it and pointed out that it was at Paradise Lakes. I think that you were broadcasting from there, and that the hosts were in the nude. And it was like, what? I was completely blown away by it. So I like to kid about it because you let me get away with it. But, I mean, who is the main audience for the show, and where can people hear it?
Well, first off, you're not the only person to not make that connection. That's almost by design, because as much as we enjoy that connection and as much as Paradise Lakes is a great sponsor, first and foremost, we do want to make it known that we're a legitimate fitness show. I have the credentials. I don't profess to be a fitness guru, but I interview a lot of people who are, both in my writing and on the radio show. And so we provide, I think, a great deal of fitness knowledge. And the show itself, which can be heard on AM 1340 in Tampa Bay on Fridays from 5 to 6 p.m., and also online at tantalk1340.com. It really it's created a community, I dare say, of fitness enthusiasts, both here in the Tampa Bay area and surprisingly around the country. And people, I'm not sure how, but around the country are listening to it online, and we've gotten great reception from you name it, book authors, prominent trainers, journalists, race directors, athletes. We had people like Martina Navratilova on when she was by phone after promoting her book. And so the whole nudist element out there at Paradise Lakes, that's helped get some publicity, but I think people think it's pretty cool. And we've been surprised at how many people have come out to Paradise Lakes to be on the show. Most stay dressed, and in fact, Sabrina and I will stay dressed if we gauge the comfort level of the people. Even though there may be literally hundreds of nude people running around, Sabrina and I will stay dressed. But in some instances, the people, and more instances than I would have thought, are more than comfortable and actually look forward to getting nude, or in fact, in some instances, have had experience going to Paradise Lakes already. So it is really a small world in so many ways.
Now, I have to point out that a lot of people think that their view of nudism in general is it's a lot of older, unattractive-looking people. But, folks, I got to tell you, Pete's a good-looking guy, and Sabrina's a good-looking woman. So whatever else you may think, these are very handsome-looking people. I just want to say that. And just
well,
what it's worth.
Thank you. We do get people from all walks of life at Paradise Lakes, but it's funny. We had a girl from the University of South Florida come out to do a story on us. I think she was doing a paper for her class or something like that, and she said, hey, would you guys mind staying dressed? And I said, oh, sure, fine. And I think like a lot of people, she had an impression that was an older crowd, and sometimes you never know on any given day,
right,
especially on Friday afternoons when people are working and so on and so forth. But that particular day, there was a young couple from Atlanta in their mid-20s. These two could have been models. The girl was just a knockout, and they just started hanging out around our show. Obviously not dressed. Sabrina and I were, and so this girl from USF comes in, probably expecting nothing but old people, and she sees a girl that looks like a young Pam Anderson without the plastic surgery. And I thought, wow, this is her first impression. So there you go.
Now, I'll just ask you. We're almost done here, but how did you get involved in the lifestyle?
Through a freelance opportunity. I had started, I think I answered an ad for the American Association for Nude Recreation, which is based in Kissimmee, Florida, represents 275 nudist resorts, and they were looking for a writer for their monthly magazine newsletter. And it's been actually one of my most long-standing freelance gigs. I've been working for them. It's not a lot. It's just a couple short stories a month, but for 12 and a half years. And through them, I got to know a lot of nudist resorts around the country, including Paradise Lakes. And in a great small world story, Joe Lettler, the owner of Paradise Lakes, his sister-in-law lived next door in St. Pete to Mike Veck, who is one of my co-authors, when Mike was working in St. Pete for the Tampa Bay Devil Rays. So, again, just a wonderful small world we have out here. Well,
and, of course, we also found, I think, in the last year how small the world was, and that the Lettlers are a neighbor of mine.
Yeah. Joe and Becky have lived in St. Pete for, I believe, almost 40 years.
Yeah.
So there you go.
It's a small world. Now, is it a coincidence that the show airs in the Tampa Bay area on a program, on a station called Can Talk?
It really has worked out. I think I was considering the show name The Fitness Buff even before Paradise Lakes signed on to sponsor it, and being on WTAN, yeah, it's completely serendipitous.
Now, last thing about that, you mentioned, of course, the show airs live on 1340 in the Tampa Bay area, but it's also on the internet. Is it only broadcast on the internet live, or is it can people download it somewhere?
At the moment, it's only live. My web master is actually, we have all the archive shows going back to its debut in October of 2005. So hopefully sometime in the first quarter of 2007, you'll be able to. I don't think we're going to load everything up there, but certainly the first dozen memorable shows I think we're going to put up there at the very least.
Maybe the one with Nina Hartley?
Nina Hartley. In fact, that's one we may re-air, just that interview, of course, at some point very soon.
Now, I don't remember. Was she on the phone, or did she come to Paradise Lakes?
No, she was on the phone. However, we had discussions with her both on the show and since that she's receptive to coming out to Paradise Lakes, and it may be we may have a book signing, but it wouldn't be part of her book tour, which has since been completed. She had a book come out back in October, but she said, like everyone else, she travels quite a bit and makes it through Tampa and Orlando every so often. So we're hoping to have her back live on the show.
Great. Well, Pete, it's always a pleasure to talk to you. I appreciate you coming on the Mr. Media podcast and doing this. And I know you've got the paperback of The Draft coming out in March, I think?
That's right. Yep, in time, probably, the Combine's in late February, but certainly a month before the draft, the paperback will be out. Well,
I would certainly encourage people who not only are football fans, but people who just like kind of a good peek behind-the-scenes story. It's a great read. You will not regret picking this book up. And so thank you, Pete, for joining us, and thank you, folks, for listening to the Mr. Media podcast.
Hey, this is comedian Mark Maron, and I love Mr. Media Radio, even though he didn't let me go on as long as some other guests.
Hey, folks. You can hear Mr. Media while on the go now with Stitcher Smart Radio. Stitcher is a free news and talk mobile app available for your smartphone, whether you use an iPhone, iPod Touch, Android, BlackBerry Curve, or Palm Pre. And when you download Stitcher to hear Mr. Media today, you have a chance to win some real money. Downloading is quick and easy. Just find Stitcher in your smartphone's app store. Download it, it's free, takes seconds. Then, during registration, hit the promo code box and enter Mr. Media, that's MR Media, to get automatically entered to win $100. The latest episode of Mr. Media will be waiting for you in Stitcher's Favorites right on your phone. You'll get access to lots of other amazing shows, too, always available to you on demand, no syncing. Some of my favorites include WTF with Mark Maron, Plus One Per Diem with Kevin Smith, and The Nerdist with Chris Hardwick. It's all free and all instant to you on Stitcher Smart Radio. And don't forget to win the money. Enter promo code Mr. Media, MR Media, when you register. And thanks for listening.